Hello, my name is Micaiah. Welcome to game design number 12. I recorded this entire thing and then I realized that I wanted to redo it. So I work on a game called Hamlet for Haven Studios, available on Steam. So we've talking about this concept of RPG design. We recorded a video of this and then we realized that we really need to split this into two separate parts. It also helps myself because in thinking about these things, they're really two separate concepts. So game design number 12 and 13 are going to be talking about this concept of RPG design. This is kind of tentatively planned. I should say that every time I say, oh, I'm going to do this, I forget about it and something else comes up. Anyway, so what we're going to be talking about today is world building. And then I'll probably just record 13 right after this, which is going to be called a dungeon building. A lot of this is based on a design document or a demo document. This is kind of a little bit different than normally what we do. A lot of things are code. There are some code aspects of this, but anyway, so we're talking about this idea of world building. We have and we actually have a pretty, maybe I should showcase what our world looks, excuse me. This is kind of what our world looks like right now. There's a different camera aspect to it, this RTS camera. We can pull back and look at this world overall. But we're trying to, but you can sort of see like this demo world is it's like a 20 by 20 that we just sort of build like a tile map, and then we place at 3, 5 3 we place a character, at 4 4 we place an axe, and at 3 3 we place a tree, and then so forth. But that sort of gets really laborious, and we want to get into this larger world concept, which is kind of we've been talking a lot about the kingdom update. This is kind of the post-kingdom update, sort of, Hamlet 2.0, we're kind of calling it. But it's sort of like, just in terms of design and where we're trying to go, and it's kind of meant to be like, and these are kind of what these videos are meant to be like, where we're kind of going, the design concepts of this, and, the really far back approach. So, anyways, one of the things we kind of started this with the ResBot, so maybe... he is actually I hope I'm getting that correct. I should have copied and pasted it. Anyways, we started this sort of concept with this person in mind, and it really became like a cool... I should mute my sound. But yeah, so, and then I think this is kind of the copied from that point. It was a little bit before this. Yeah, he's working on this spaceship design. You can sort of see in the bottom left there. Anyways, and then yeah, there's a little bit. Anyway, so he's working with a sort of ECS system. This is kind of what it looks like. This is kind of, we talked about a little bit about this in the previous where we were working on this Hamlet sort of, or this this space concept. So we kind of we're working with the trait systems and a lot of this stuff. So. Anyway, so then he talks a little bit about this. This is kind of his second level concept, but this is kind of where he started. And this kind of reminds me, so he's using the entity component system, but this is for C++, and it's fun to learn from the AI, because he was one of the AI programmers on The Sims. And it seems like he has a lot of cool knowledge about what they did and some of the things they accomplished. He's using the entity component system from the C++, sort of from the game development world, in the concepts of using entities, and as this is sort of like an entity as a character in his world, and he has lots of these characters and they do various things. This is his previous example of a RPG element he built, which we kind of liked because this is kind of where it more lines up exactly what we're working on. We are working on these sort of two similar concepts. You can sort of see the same similar concepts with him as well. With you have this RPG or space, it's still the same. That's the genre, but it's still, you have these characters that are doing something. He talks about this this flower florist is sort of one of these RPG character aspects he has. And then this florist has a name. He has various stats as an RPG character, and then he belongs to factions, and is that person claimed or not, and various things like that. And then he has these relationships. We are working on a very similar relationship values between, here's all his characters, here's all the relationship values. We use this as kind of interesting way to display this data. we use inspectors and Unity right now to sort of. Anyways, this kind of reminded me of the multi-user dimensions we've been talking about in the last few videos, especially the Moria. This is kind of that town of Moria that he's built out, and this is kind of like the same concept of taking the town of Moria and then making it alive with, I was thinking about, I'm not sure exactly what his concept was, but here's maybe an inn with beds and various characters. I'm not sure exactly what these things represent, but you can sort of see these are different houses. Like here's maybe one of these houses could be the florist shop, and then the florist goes around and does various things, which is kind of exactly what we're talking about in that terms of world building with the character, and that's kind of the sort of the concept of taking the world and then putting characters and having interact with the world. That's our goal, and you'll see a lot of that coming out through this. So, anyways, that's my take on it. It's really fun to learn from someone who's kind of been in the industry, and then he's got his own sort of system. I'd love to see where he goes with that, and then we we'll work with that. But this is kind of more as we sort of these are just meshes of ideas. They're not actually any. There's just kind of the overall goal is talking about world building. Anyway, so then we have this person named Transcendent. He's been talking about this. I wasn't sure in the last video, but that's not being showed. But in this, he's actually was building a more of like a Zelda or a Final Fantasy clone, an 2D RPG. And then I was like, but it's fun to sort of watch design videos, especially if they're fun and cool. And he seems like he has a little bit of game development experience. So, anyways, but then then he put out this video about a Unity ECS system. He was talking about a lot of the problems. I totally agree with him on a lot of these problems. For instance, one of the things he pointed out that was that he has this nav mesh system that he's trying to work with, but it doesn't work with ECS. That causes a problem because a lot of the nav mesh system relies on things that you can't read and write, and it's really. But anyways, we like this concept because it was really cool because of his castle walls in his town. So you can sort of definitely see the sort of the world building aspects, very similar to this, but it's sort of like now you have these much larger building, much more buildings, and and more of a castle. This is sort of a mini town versus now you get this castle village area, and we'll see kind of a different examples as we continue on here. One of the things he was working on with the ECS through the Unity, which is kind of the more the dot system, that includes the burst compiler, the entity components, sort of that similar concept to the ECS that Rez was working with, but that also includes the job system from Unity, and there's a math library and a lot of things. A lot of that's sort of still in progress. That's kind of what this is kind of well, I think I'm not sure if we're going to be talking about this Monday. This will be out on Wednesday after this video, but the Hamlet will be talking a little bit about working on version 4 of the game engine, which includes the ECS. But I just don't think ECS as this video is sharing is not ready. So we've been learning these concepts, but we're not because it would be fun to sort of build this larger. That's kind of why we think about Hamlet 2.0, building this larger world with a lot more people. That's maybe a little too many people, but it really showcases the concept of what we're trying to accomplish, where we want. I guess we'll talk a little bit more about the town in the next one, because it's a little bit more easier to talk about some of the towns, but it's just these buildings have purposes. Some of them are homes. People live in these homes, and then they work. And then various castle aspects. So anyway, so we really like the blocking examples of these. And it's, we're not a big huge graphics fan. We just like the idea of we will sacrifice quite a bit of graphics because we're not an artist. We're more of a programmer. But we feel like this is actually a pretty decent example of cool castle walls that have towers. And then would also be really fun if we could actually build this RTS system where you could, put down you start a castle wall, and then as you stretch it out, and then you say, oh, here, I want to build a gate system here, and various things like that. So we'll have to see exactly how, that's kind of one of the major concepts of how do we build. I would be curious really how he built this town up, if he hand placed a lot of this stuff. We've been thinking about these are sort of Veroni, these could be sort of buildings or that were built sort of on a like a a polygon mesh or something like that. But then and these actually do have colliders, and you can turn on the nav mesh, which is great. Maybe and that's sort of one of the things too. Like these are sort of what it would more look like. In our, I think our next town, no, our next town example. Maybe we should talk about this one next. But you can see more of a, like these, the buildings are not always, they're sometimes square, but there's oftentimes not square buildings. So this is kind of how we get the tiles to work with that is another concept. But anyways, and then it's just really cool. And then you have these different roads and paths and stuff like that you can take, and then various aspects happen. I think we'll skip the boss battles we'll come back to that. But this is just a Google image search we took off. We were just looking at castles and towns and various concepts. It's kind of an RTS sort of. This is almost 45 degrees. You can see bosses has a 90 degrees sort of. Looking at some of these concepts, but it's really this same sort of high level concept of this is a town. And it has, the north gate, the south gate, the west gate, and then the east gate is sort of involved in this castle area. And you can't, this is sort of like the castle kind of has this natural moat here where it'd be hard pressed to sort of cross here and fight your way up this mountain with any number of large forces. So it's kind of an ideal situation. But so anyways, you kind of get that same sort of concept of here's these castle walls. They sort of have, they and then here's a little maybe dock area. You can see little docks and really cool things. And you got ships and trade and all sorts of things happening, including the farms to feed this entire village. So it's really nice that you can sort of see this overarching world building point. Where, and the other thing too we were talking about a little bit is this idea of we want to build the world in such a way that it's like it gets interesting world examples, and we have some ideas for that. And then it's like we have these rivers and right now we're just focusing on little islands that are surrounded in seas and stuff, because those are the simplest concept. We want to exactly we also want to build up this world where it's like you can see this larger world that has many aspects to it of rivers and also roads and paths. And then this kind of like where you think about this path through here is just maybe through the town, which is kind of like where exactly what these guys are doing here. Maybe I should copy and cut. This is kind of a little bit harder. There we go. Seems like it makes a little bit more sense. Post this. Anyway, so then it's like you get this little you can sort of see the various similarities between this. It's just the aspects ratios and where they're, sort of this is more, this is kind of where we're trying to get to more exactly, where it's like you have these castles, sort of walls that are sitting in the 3D world, and then these buildings will be more 3D buildings that we're going to be placing in the world. And then how we lay this out. It'd be interesting to see how we laid this out. I mean, with polygons and roads and various things. And then this is sort of like, more of an artist concept, but we want to get that same approach of building the castles, building the towers, and then having different levels of walls and different levels of gates, and then having castles and various aspects. So anyways, one of the things we're talking a little bit about, if we zoom in, we weren't sure about the scale of this, but one concept we were talking about, I think last time, is this idea of this one tile road, and then that sort of fits great, but then it's like you have this probably really is more 3 or 4 or 5 tiles across, and then 20 or it's depending on the scale. I was thinking about these are like 8x8 watchtowers, but these could be smaller, 4x4, sort of like forest watchtowers kind of sort of now, where it's like just a kind of a it's just has a one stair up, or ladder up or something. And then, but this gate system might actually be, quite a bit bigger, and you can see the road kind of expands out a little bit. Anyway, but then it's just like taking that concept of having this tile, 2 or 3 tiles, and then having this entire gate system and how that interacts. The other thing too, we were talking a little bit about before, but sort of, you didn't get to see that, is like here's a church, there's a church building. And then here's maybe an inn or a blacksmith or whatever. It's like there's purposes to these buildings. And then here's like maybe a military. This could be a church. It might be a church, but I was thinking on this, either as a church. Maybe this is more graveyards now that I'm zoomed in more closely on it. But it's like this plot of land could also be a military barracks as well. This is obviously a church now that I sort of see it a little bit better, but this could be a barracks as well, so that the military would come in here and and camp out, or like Roman cities would have that a lot as well, where this is sort of the military runs the guards, and they have these big barracks, and then also too you can sort of my bad, a little bit further. Pause is pretty cool, so I can't wait to get into that either. Also, but then you can also see down here is that we have this dock area where this is definitely a dock, and you can sort of see these wharfs or jetties that pull out, and the ships will come in here and then dock here, unload their goods, and then trade with the ship. So we want that kind of really large concept of which sort of fits into this idea of a kingdom, which runs towns, and then these towns are supported by all these people, and then we want to get that's where the ECS of these massive units can fit into this. So it's kind of where the 2.0 version of the game is going, but we need to sort of build some of the underlying technology to get this, and then too, how do you go from sort of this zoomed out view and then down into this sort of much more close-up view, and then we go into this Boz's battle here. Let me zoom out a little bit and fix which Boz's battle is talking about. Well, from there, how do you go into a this is like more of a character view, and then this actually is really cool with this yeah, and then this is more of the concept side of things. So, Boz's battle is actually pretty cool, because when we actually have we recorded here it is right here. Recorded. This is kind of like, you can see now that we sort of zoomed out. Here's King's Landing. This is part of Game of Thrones. Boz's battle did this battle of the five armies. I think it's whatever it's one of the prehistory battles that leads up to the Game of Thrones, with Robert Baratheon's in charge, and the stag. And anyways, it's talking a little bit about here's some of these concepts of, here's King's Landing, and this is kind of the other thing too, is like, how do we take this world where you have these polygon sort of planet view, which is kind of what we're thinking about, or this is sort of more of a the Westeros, or this west side of the world. And then they have this King's Landing, so here's our port city that we're just looking at, but now it's like this is more of the sea. And anyway, so this is kind of like talking about we kind of recorded a GIF off of this that sort of really showcases the fact that we're in this sort of view, and then he zooms back into this high level view of the town. So it's like, here's the town, and then we zoom into this is kind of a more like stage 0, but you could also think about that, as you're looking at that town from this planet view, which we should maybe grab a shot of somewhere in here, sort of the map view as well. You can kind of think of the map view, showcase that, and then from there we go into this sort of world view, and then we go down into this sort of much more detailed town view, down into the individual buildings, and this is kind of what this is talking about here, which this is kind of where this goes through, where these are actually individual people. You can see here's our one tile. These are actually, maybe these walls are maybe two tiles thick or whatever in our example, but we think about these as one tile. As the concepts here, so it's definitely this, and this kind of this. How do we get from here to there? He uses a fade effect. We're probably not that excited about the fade effect, but then you can see that this character is going to eventually walk into this area, pass his guards, walk over here and sit down, and then that's where we get into this screenshot of he walked past his guards, is now he's sitting down, and then the concept is from here. We have these, these are the entities, and there's, gardeners out here, or maybe, whatever, guards, But then each of these people have names. You can look at that. That here's I don't know who a lot of these people are because I don't watch Game of Thrones. But anyway, it's fantasy, so it's definitely follow a little. But here we got this Renly Baratheon, which is a family name that fits with maybe one of his sons. I was thinking about someone important because maybe some of the other people wouldn't be in this meeting. And then you got this person named Varys, doesn't have a last name, so he's probably just a an advisor. He's somewhat important because he's in this meeting. But then and then we also have this Percival, so who's someone else. But then you also see here's Peter. Yeah, he seems more importantly because he has a last name, Peter Baelish, which sounds really familiar. If it sounds like he'd be someone important in Game of Thrones, so maybe But anyways, but then we also get this concept of that Peter Baelish, or no, Robert Baratheon is the focus. So he has in medieval times a knight or a king would have a crest of his family, which is the stags, and then this is kind of the pre-battle where he's talking about that he wants more wine. And then it's sort of like this story level concept too, and that's kind of where like this world is like. Here's King's Landing, here's River Run, here's I don't know some other towns that we could focus on from the GIF over here, right here. Here's River Run up here. I think there's another famous town over here. I can't remember where the Tyrians are from. And anyway, so then here's King's Landing, where the Iron Throne, I believe, sits here. And then up here we have the north, which is sort of the wall. And so there's not like, overall, King's Landing maybe gets, various, gets, from their fishing villages, gets fish and food, and they support themselves, and maybe the trade as well, and then maybe more of the more important trade comes through here. But there's like this whole entire concept of this is kind of more like Hamlet 3.0 is like now we're down to a town, but then we also do this sort of world building concept of kingdoms. Like what 2.0 is kingdom, one kingdom, but then 3.0 could be this kingdoms idea, where it's like multiple. This is kind of what this is talking about, is this battle between the northern, because of some of the backstory of how, and that's sort of like this this will probably be filled in this prequels they're talking about doing now, but this those are sort of the individual stories are not really clear. That's why I like the history of these things because it sort of sets up the why things happen the way they did. Why is this war started over this slight between these two. Well, it's not a slight, but the history between these two. This Baratheon household, and then versus the I don't remember. There's a whole concept of who the people in the north. I think it's part of the. Anyway, so the Starks, I believe, the Starks, and how they, and then anyways, and then that's all post the Mad King. So it's like there's which that's kind of like talking about this idea that the world building is not just the world from the high level concept of the we should grab we should just do a screen grab right here. But it's not just this high map view, but it's also this idea of there's not just the high map view, but it's also this idea that we also want to get down into this, down to the individual buildings, which actually kind of maybe should be above this, because it's like more like these are the different levels of zooms, and that's kind of one of the focus is how do we get these different levels of zooms, where we start at the planet view, sort of this is the hemisphere view, and then we get down to the town view, into the actual what's happening in the town. So I think you can see like this is the abstract of what's happening at this town, and then you could see various concepts maybe there, but then we actually get to see the individual people down into the individual buildings, which is kind of our next right. This is kind of where the bows is. Bows. So then we're talking about. This is probably a pretty long video already. I thought this splitting up would make it shorter. Anyways, then we get down to how do we actually build these sort of concepts from the and this is kind of like this is a piece of this world, and then this is kind of like this is graph grammar by not, which is really cool because he's talking about this really concept idea of he decides, hey, I want this concept here. The video it's not even showcasing how cool this really is, but and then he has these defines the graph, the grammar, sort of the idea of how this happens, and then it builds worlds like this procedurally. And then these are sort of like, there is a concept here of these spheres are sort of sizes of islands or something, and then this maybe one concept we're working on right now, because we're sort of at this level right here. We're building these islands, and now we need to connect them together, and this is sort of a I'm not. This is more like a dungeon or some sort of example of, and it's really cool because it's like you get the same. I guess we'll talk. Maybe we should include some of that in the next video, which is talking about dungeons. But anyways, it's also this idea of how to get into this individual. These are sort of Veroni polygons, which are kind of like these houses. These little buildings are kind of Veronis or some sort of polygon level, which is kind of more substandard of how it would actually maybe look more realistic. And then from there, also too, this is kind of like this idea of how to get this. If this world is this massive, how do we get it from? How do we showcase this world? And this is actually, I was looking for this quite a while ago when I was thinking about this. This was made a long time ago, but it's like this idea of this is the world size, and then these are chunks, but you can't display all the data you wanted to do. And this is like this individual chunk is how, here's these islands or these types, castles or cities or whatever it is. That's the other thing too, is like these are people, these are castles, these are cities, these are islands. It's not. The high level concept of this is not to decide what data it is, it's just the level of detail of that data. And this is kind of like these dark greens are sort of showcasing, these are what's loaded, which is sort of like these green things that are loaded. But out here you can see like this is not dark green because it's outside of the view of the concept of these, that things are happening out here, but that we're not as well aware of it. So it's like it's sort of segregating our data and loading in data so we can sort of have this interconnected world. These are most active of the and this could even be too of like this concept here is like, well, now we're getting down to that town level, and then in this sort of center area now we're getting down to the very people level. Like Robert Baratheon is traveling from Westeros into the King's Landing, or whatever, Westeros maybe over here into the King's Landing, and it's like he's traveling through this. We know that's happening, but we're not interested until he's actually into this. Oh, now we see the King's retinue coming through, and now it's like now we start loading in, oh man, there's a column of army, and then now we get into this. He's entering into that building, into this individual, he's walking from this point, from this point over into this building that he's actually in. And now that we're sort of in that building, now we actually, everything that's happening in that, from that concept. Like the guards are going out and doing things and things are happening outside of the building, or maybe they're just standing guard, they're not as active. But eventually they have to switch out the guards and do all these other things that are happening on this high level concept of the local view right here around this, in this sort of main concept is like these could also be people as well. It really doesn't matter, but it's like around here we get these guards that are sort of standing around people, gardeners. The town is being active, but we're sort of, that's sort of the cursory view, but now we're looking at these people as, these are what's active. Here's the guards over here, here's, Peter Baelish and Robert Baratheon and various people are now interacting on this sort of local, per person level, which is kind of where this is where we get this. This is Robert Baratheon. I was talking about this. Here's Robert Baratheon, as a character, he can go up and pick up an axe, and enter a house, and do various things, and on that level. And that's kind of like this sort of, and this is kind of the idea of how to go from. That's kind of the overall idea, is how to go from this overall world concept of this is the planet, sort of, this is not even the planet view, but this is a hemisphere view, we're calling this, where it's like now you can see, like before, like we also have this idea of, well, from here we can also go into the planet view, um, which is the planet view, is things are happening on a planet, and we have different levels for that, but we're not there yet, and maybe we'll never be there in terms of game development. But it's definitely this concept of how to take this planet view, that things are happening on this planet of Game of Thrones, and then on here's now where you get this map sort of view, and then you can maybe look at these towns, and then declare, and then up here you can right click and say declare war on this kingdom, which is kind of the next sort of the kingdoms, with the kingdoms view. Now we get the kingdom, single one view, and then so it's kind of, that's some of the other high level concepts as well, is that and then we go from there to the individual town, then what's happening in the town, and this kind of like, this is like that cursory view of what's happening in the town, and now we get into this individual, like what's happening at the castle. Now we get there's probably missing a step in here of from here we're probably missing a step, the castle or the castle local view. This includes buildings, guards, gardeners, sort of what's, you can sort of barely, I don't think that's spelled right, but anyways, it's just the concepts. It's mostly, but you can see these are gardeners. Maybe they're picking apples, or doing various things. Could be a spy, maybe right here, like pretending to be a gardener. We until you actually go over and inspect and see what's happening, or he gets caught, and then but now you also have these guards. And then you have these, and then these include individual people that here's your Peter Baelish, and that's kind of like this concept of time as well. Of like, this is where Peter Baelish is in 299 AC, of the time, and then and now this is kind of how we procedurally generate all this stuff, and then this is kind of the over. So yeah, it's kind of, and this is just kind of a helpful document put together for me to sort of handle, like, how do I do that? How do I look at that concept from, this idea of the RPG design, and then so now we're talking about the world building, and then the next episode we'll be talking about dungeon. Is that now that we've got this, it's sort of this local view of the dungeon. That's something that's also part of this. It fits in this world, but now we're how do we build the dungeon view? Sort of, it's also the building view is another way to think about it. But anyways, I'm working on a game for Hamlet. It's hopefully going to include a lot of these things at some point. I know it's a very far out view of this world, but it should be pretty cool. So thanks very much. I'll see everybody next time. You take care.